Hi all, my name is Gayatri Padalla, working with Microsoft as a PostgreSQL performance expert. Boosting the PostgreSQL server's performance using Azure Advisor recommendations is the best way to identify any vulnerabilities your server is going through. You will be informed proactively, and anyone who is moving from Oracle who is not aware about the internals of the PostgreSQL, for them, this is the best approach to identify their server's vulnerability and get it fixed. With the introduction, let's dive into the topic of today, which is how we boost our PostgreSQL server using the enhanced Azure Advisor performance recommendations. We are gonna optimize the PostgreSQL server's performance using the best practices Azure Advisor has to provide. Moving on, um, the agenda today we will be covering would be about Azure Advisor, how to set up the Azure Advisor alerts, the different performance recommendations implemented for Azure PostgreSQL Server, different scenarios, which are the different recommendations set up, walkthrough of one specific recommendation, and the conclusion. That's the flow of this talk. Let's go ahead. Coming to Azure Advisor. Azure Advisor is actually a digital cloud interface which analyzes your resource configuration, your usage telemetry, and come up with a tailored set of recommended actions proactively to improve your cost efficiency, performance, reliability, and security of your Azure resources. Azure Advisor alerts are something which you could set up based on the recommendations you receive so that you are proactively informed in terms of email or message about your behavior of your PostgreSQL servers. In this demo, we will be going through how you could create those Azure Advisor alerts, setting up the action groups, and how you could receive the notifications. Let's get to the Azure portal to see how to create your Azure Advisor alerts. Your Azure Advisor alerts are something which will help you proactively receive alerts on your recommendations for your server uh, on your phone or email. Let's see how to set them up. Go to your Azure Advisor portal and then type in Advisor. On your left hand pane, you will be seeing monitoring and then alerts. Go to alerts, click on New Advisor Alert. In this page, pick up the um, subscription and then the resource group which you want to create an alert for. Here, when you set the alert condition, there are multiple ways to set it up. One is at category level or impact level or at recommendation type. Or you could just not select anything and go ahead, which means you will be receiving alerts for every other recommendation. Most probably, I would suggest you to go ahead and do it specifically for performance as we are going through that. And then high, at least you are able to catch all the alerts which are coming for the servers with a high recommendation and working on them. So once you select the condition, you could also go by recommendation type, which is just names of the recommendations. All the PostgreSQL recommendations are prefixed with review your server. So you can just pick one of the recommendations and set up a alert just for that one. In this demo, we'll just go by category and impact level. Once you're done with that, you can create an action group which will tell you, like, notify you if there is a recommendation which is triggered on one of your resources. And also, you could set up some actions using it. Let's see how to do that. Here, you could either select one of the action groups which are already created, or if you could create a new one. When you create a new one, you are again selecting the subscription and the resource group. Then for the region, you could either go with global if you have your servers set up in different locations, or you could just go to the specific locations where your servers are located. My server is located in the East US, so I'll go with there. And here I'm just giving it some name and then display name, test alert. And then next we go to the notifications tab. Um, In the notification type, you will see email Azure Resource Manager role and email SMS message. I'm going to go with the email SMS message. Once you click on that, just provide a name. It's optional, but yeah, here you on the right hand pane where you see whether you want it the notification as an email or phone, you could select accordingly and click OK. So here I'm going to go with email, set up my office email ID, and then click OK. Then here is where I was talking about the actions. We have different ways how you can set up an action. So for the alert, if you're selecting specific recommendation type and you know how to handle it, you can set it up using in one of these forms and pick that action type and give a name. So whenever a recommendation is triggered, the action is also taken. In this demo, we will just go through how to set up the notification. Then let's click on review and create. Hit create. Once this action group is created, it's connected to your alert. And here you will give an alert name. So here I'm giving it a name as performance related um, high impact recommendations. I just want those to be alerted for. And then you could either give a description or not, and then pick the resource group on which you want this to be running, and then create an alert. Once you're done with it, you will be informed proactively through your email or phone about the recommendations for the servers which fall into that category. Moving on, Azure Advisor performance recommendations on Azure on PostgreSQL Server for Azure are we have recommendations set up for whenever we notice the scenarios on your resources. When we identify an inactive replication slot or checkpoints which are happening too frequently on your server, or if you have a long running transaction for more than 24 hours, if you have any orphan prepared transaction which is degrading your server's performance. Similarly, we have many more such recommendations to flows. Those are if you have a high bloat ratio on your server, or your server is approaching a wraparound situation, if your server is mostly at a high CPU utilization, which is greater than 90% for almost consistently 2 hours, and there are some logging parameters and auto vacuum parameter which can impact the performance. So we trigger recommendations for all the above scenarios. And in this talk, we will walk you through each of these scenarios and how it impacts and how the recommendation will make your server performant and be out of that scenario. Let's go through that. Inactive replication slot. Replication slots are the things which take care of retaining the wall files before they are until they are consumed by the replica. If an replication slot is inactive, then which means the wall files are not being consumed by the replica, and these wall files remain on the primary server occupying the disk. And it also leads to dead tuples not getting cleaned up. So to avoid getting into a scenario where your disk is being utilized and your dead tuples are not getting clean, in turn, which impacts the query performance and the server performance, we ask you to drop the inactive replication slot. So you a trigger is a recommendation is triggered on your server if we identify there is an inactive replication slot, and the recommended actions which within that replication or within that recommendation would point you how you could drop that inactive replication slot. Going ahead, let's move on to a trigger or a recommendation which points if there is checkpoints happening frequently on your server. Checkpoints do is set up based on two parameters, which is checkpoint completion target and checkpoint timeout. If your server is set up with a checkpoint timeout of 5 minutes and your checkpoints are happening every 5 minutes, then that's a way to go. But sometimes, if your workload is too heavy and your max wall size, which is a parameter which lets the walls to grow until that specific maximum size set, and then it automatically triggers a checkpoint, in which scenario the checkpoints become more requested rather than timed. In such scenarios, it impacts the server by using up a lot of the disk IO, and it uses CPU resources and also degrades the performance of the other workload happening on the server, because it's using most of the resources in doing checkpoints itself. So to avoid that, in this recommendation we walk you through recommended action where we ask you to update your max wall size parameter accordingly. So here, to do that, if you go to the troubleshooting guides within the Azure portal, under the IOPS tab, you will be walked through checkpoints, and we provide you some selected queries using which you can find out how much GB is getting transmitted or accumulated between the two checkpoints. And based on that, you can set a higher value of the max wall size parameter so that your checkpoints are not requested. They would be, if they are mostly timed, then your server performance is optimized there. Coming to the next recommendation, which is long running transaction. Long running transaction recommendation is triggered if you have a transaction which is running for more than 24 hours, which means it's blocking the auto vacuum from cleaning the dead tuples, using the resources of IO and CPU, holds locks on the objects for extended period of time, and it also causes to increase replication lag. To avoid all the above scenarios mentioned, we suggest you to go ahead um, based on the recommended actions. We take you through the PIDs and the duration on how long those PIDs have been active and running. What you could do is terminate that PID to let the server get back to its normal state and perform um, um, and improve the server's performance. In this demo, I'll walk you through one of the recommendations so that you know how to navigate through and how to follow the recommendation actions provided, and all the details on the recommendations. If you go to a particular server, either you receive a recommendation alert in your email, or if you go to your particular server and then if you navigate down on the overview page, you will see a recommendations um, in the taskbar, and you will see all the recommendations which are triggering on that specific Azure resource. Or on the left hand side panel, you will see Azure Advisor recommendations. You could go to that window also and see. If you go to that window, you will see more details like what are the potential benefits in implementing this recommendation. So let's go there. And here, if you see, it provides you the name of the recommendation, the category, the potential benefits, and when was this recommendation triggered latest. So let's go to one of the recommendations, which is here long running transactions. When I go to the long running transactions, it tells you the recommendation details on when a particular transaction is captured as a long running transaction. At this moment, we are capturing any long running transactions which are running for more than 24 hours. And it will impact the server performance by holding the resources and also not letting the vacuum to clean up the dead tuples, increasing the replication log, and holding the CPU and IO resources, which in turn slows down your server's performance. So here we have provided the server name, the recommendation actions, and the reason will provide you with the PIDs and the duration in which those PIDs have been running for a long time. Like for how long are they running? It will provide you that information in hours. So once we go through all this information over here, let's go through the recommended actions. When you click on this recommended actions, it takes you to the troubleshooting guides. Under CPU, if you scroll down, you will see long running transactions. Navigate to the long running transactions. And if you scroll through the bottom of the page, you will be seeing different recommendations on what could be done. Because these PIDs have been running for longer time, I can just use the terminate PG terminate backend command to kill those transactions. So I'll just copy and paste it, copy the command, take the PID and go ahead and run this command to kill the long running transactions. Once you kill the long running transactions, the CPU resources are released. Your cleaning of dead tuples will be initiated, and your replication lag will also reduce. Now that you have gone through that demo and understood how the recommendation works and where you can find them, let's walk through the next recommendation we have, which is on orphan prepared transactions. So, orphan prepared transaction might happen when you have a prepared transaction running and suddenly your client crashes. What it does during that time is it still hold the logs for that transaction, which in turn blocks the auto vacuum from cleaning up the dead tuples, and also any query performances hitting that table within the transaction is degraded. So to avoid that, we ask you to commit or roll back the transaction. In the recommendation, we will show you for how long that prepared transaction has been holding the resources. And we, from the troubleshooting guides in the auto vacuum blocker section, we provide you a query using which is table PG prepared execs. If you do a select on that, and you can find the GID of that orphan prepare transaction, you either commit that GID or roll back that GID to free up your server from that orphan prepare transaction, enabling your server to be performant. Next comes the high bloat ratio. Bloat ratio is the unnecessary space which is accumulated by the dead tuples, um, which again happens because of the frequent updates and deletes happening on a specific table or a group of tables. So, having a high bloat ratio of greater than 80% is when this recommendation is triggered. If your bloat ratio is 80% on a specific table or a database, which means your query performance, the optimizer has to swift through all those dead tuples. So it's taking longer time, and it's you consuming a lot of resources, and also the dead tuples are occupying the disk space. So in such scenarios, your query performance is degraded. So in the recommendation, we ask you to go ahead and perform a vacuum analyze verbose by identifying the tables which have the highest bloat. Going ahead to the next recommendation, which is triggered when you are approaching a wraparound situation. What is a wraparound? Wraparound is a situation when you are reaching the maximum transaction ID on that server. So PostgreSQL uses a 32-bit counter, which means you're allowed to go for a maximum of 2 billion transactions. However, this recommendation doesn't wait for so long. It is triggered whenever you reach the 50% of that 2 billion, which is 1 billion. Whenever you approach 1 billion transaction and cross it, this recommendation will be triggered, which tells you, hey, your server has already crossed 1 billion transactions. And why would you go into that scenario is when you have a huge transaction volume and your vacuuming is happening irregularly. When you approach, or when you are closer to the 2 billion transaction, or when you're approaching the wraparound situation, actually your server goes into a read only mode to avoid getting into storage full situation, and this also degrades the performance. So it's better we address this situation when you are 50% near to your wraparound situation. So this recommendation takes you through auto vacuum blocker troubleshooting guide, where we check if there are any blockers on that server and remove those blockers, whether it's long running transaction or orphan prepare transaction or any inactive replication slots. We walk you through how you can remove them, and also you could run a vacuum freeze to freeze the transaction IDs for the identified table. So the troubleshooting guide will help you identify those tables, and then you can run a vacuum freeze on those tables to get your server back to a performance state. Coming to high CPU utilization. High CPU utilization recommendation is triggered when you have high CPU or greater than 90% of your CPU utilization for almost 2 plus hours. Then this recommendation is triggered. Why do you get into this situation? Is mostly if you're running inefficient queries, which is using too much of the CPU resources, or you have high number of connections hit on the server, and if you have too many locks, heavyweight locks happening because of the queries which are being run, again it talks about the inefficient queries here. If your PG stats are outdated, in all these scenarios, you will see that your CPU utilization has gone high. The moment your CPU utilization goes high, your performance of the server, of the queries degrades. To avoid to be in that situation, we walk you through using the recommended actions. We walk you through the CPU troubleshooting guides, where we identify the different scenarios on identifying the top 5 slow running queries, and which is utilizing your CPU. You could go through the queries and optimize them, walk you through how many connections are happening on the server so that you can plan it accordingly so that you're not hitting as many connections. Coming to heavyweight locks, if there are too many locks happening, then you could optimize and see how you can clean up those locks and progress further. And you could do that by optimizing your queries again. If your PG stats are outdated, where the optimizer is not able to take the perfect optimal plan, that also causes the issue. So run an analyze command and get your PG stats updated. This is how the recommendations would proactively help you. Coming to the next slide, where I talk about multiple recommendations here. Till now, we have spoke about all the high impacting recommendations. Now we'll be speaking about some of the medium impacting recommendations. Um, these are more about the logging. If you enable these logging parameters like statement stats, log mean duration statement, log duration, log statement, and log error verbosity, all these parameters do extra logging so that you can monitor, analyze your query, and optimize your queries. So, if you're really into auditing and optimizing, enabling these parameters is the best way to go, but for a shorter period of time. Once you're done with monitoring and optimizing your queries, we suggest you to turn them back on. So, here, if your log statement stats are turned on, we trigger a recommendation. Coming to logmin duration, if it's enabled and if it's set to less than 1 minute, then also we trigger a recommendation here. So log duration, when it's turned on, which means you're capturing the duration of the statements being run. So then we capture that and we keep you informed that, hey, your logging parameters have been turned on and it's set to this specific value, please turn it back on if you're not still optimizing your queries, or if you've forgotten to turn them back off after you're optimizing and monitoring. So once you do that, your performance would be out of your server would be out of all that extra logging, and your performance would be better. Coming to auto vacuum is a backend process which cleans up your dead tuples and updates your statistics. If you're turning off this parameter, which would lead to the accumulation of the dead tuples, statistics not being updated, which in turn impacts your query performance and the server performance. So we suggest you to always keep this parameter turned on. So as part of the recommendation for all these recommendations, the recommendation action will lead you to the server parameter page where you can update these server parameters with the recommended values. Here, with all this information, we are concluding this talk. You could clearly see how you could leverage the Azure Advisor recommendation, identify the different vulnerabilities or the performance issues your server is going through, and using the recommended actions provided in the troubleshooting guides or through the server parameter updates, bringing back your server to a performance state and improve the performance of your server and queries. Thank you.